Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bella Gamer, and we're back this time with the promised cleric domain spell changes from the remaster. I said I was going to do it. I intended to do it yesterday, and then I realized, oh, I have like 30 more spells to look through. This is going to take a minute, and it did. It was like 4 hours, I think, of research and checking everything over, making sure everything was, either different or the same or whatever. But we're here, and I don't even know if I really need to state this anymore for legal purposes since it's officially out. But I guess I do just because it might color your opinion of the video. Paizo did provide to me the player core and the GM core book, but this is not sponsored content, obviously. So all opinions here are my own. So that being the case, let's go ahead and get started. I got quite the list. So I'm going to try to burn through it as quickly as possible. So first off, blind ambition was changed to now. Oh, let me move the camera. I'm going to remember this time. There we go. Ignite ambition. So ignite ambition is just a different spell altogether than it used to be before. Now it's a reaction. Its trigger is you or an ally within range use a mental effect to convince a creature to do something, and range 60 feet. The targets is one creature being influenced. Now, before, what it used to be, blind ambition, it used to reduce a creature's essentially like resistances to being influenced. But it was an action and it would last for, like 10 minutes. Really good outside of combat in some situations, but it was still a spell. It still had the verbal component. So it was really hard to utilize because obviously you're just going to use magic and people aren't just going to sit there and accept it, right? Well, Ignite Ambition is a subtle spell, so now you can do it, and it's a reaction. So this is actually really good, and especially even if the target succeeds, they get a -1 stats penalty to its defenses against whatever the triggering effect is, -2 if it's something that would push their own ambitions. And even if they succeed, the target doesn't realize you even cast a spell, which is different than some of the other manipulation type spells. I think this one overall works better. It works much better in combat too, since it's not spending 2 actions and a focus point. This is a reaction when an ally or even yourself are trying to do something to, coerce or use a suggestion spell. It's overall just better now. And it even is a buff considered if we compare it to the last one, because now on failure, the target gets a -4 rather than just a -2, which is pretty big. So overall, and actually this is a general theme for a majority of the changes to the cleric domain stuff. Much of them just got buffed. Much of them just got better. So I'm all here for it, and you are all going to be very happy with some of these changes, I can guarantee. Now we're going to hop to the city domain where we get face in the crowd. It's actually got a buff. So in addition to the additional stuff before, where it's the +2 stats bonus to deception and stealth checks to go incognito when you're in a crowd and you ignore the difficult terrain or whatever, this also counts as setting up a disguise to impersonate as someone in the crowd. And even if you aren't trained in deception, you can still add your level, which is pretty cool. So the major feature, why you might not understand, is this is something where when you're in a crowd, necessarily, you might get concealed, you treat it as difficult terrain. This is something that doesn't necessarily prevent the enemy from finding you. But since this counts as, creating a disguise, that means they will need to make a deception or a perception check against your deception DC to identify you, rather than a stealth check, which you just might not be as good as. So overall, Face in the Crowd got a pretty sizable buff for what honestly is its intended use, which is just to blend in with a crowd. Also from the city domain, we got a name change, and this is something that I don't understand why this needed to happen. But there's some name changes here in the domain spells. I know most of these are not like D&D spells, but some of the ones that had more significant changes did get a name change. For instance, Pulse of the City, right? Yeah, Pulse of the City has now changed to Pulse of Civilization. And it changes. It got buffed, more or less. It now lasts for 8 hours. And now, rather than just like getting information about a specific individual or something in the event, some public information, you just get a bonus to all lore checks to recall knowledge on those settlements or to gather information in or about those settlements. Not only that, but it can be heightened a little bit higher, now going to a 500-mile range, and the bonus increasing to a +3. Overall, Pulse of Civilization got a massive buff because now it's an investigation tool. It just gives you bonuses to essentially collecting information in a city rather than needing to spend a focus point and resting 10 minutes or, multiple and resting 10-minute interval, whatever, to gain little bits of information. This is pretty huge, honestly, and will make this spell work better for its intent. Now, I'm not trying to claim that this is like a very strong ability or anything. It's very specific and very niche, but for its intended purpose, this is a pretty sizable buff. So overall, City's Domain getting pretty good buffs. All right, here's just a name change, nothing else changed. Splash of Art got changed to Creative Splash. I don't know why. And I'm pretty neutral on the name change. I don't know. Nothing really of major note here other than a name change. In the Confidence domain, Veil of Confidence no longer increases your frightened condition when you crit fail a frightened effect. Now, whenever you crit fail a fear effect thing, it still reduces your frightened condition you would have gained from it by 1, but it ends just like it did before. This is overall just removing an unnecessary downside to using a spell, because like there's no point in using a focus point spell if it's just going to give you more downsides. Even though it's based on a crit failure, which is very unusual, it still felt really bad. You're just like, I use this thing, oh, but I got a bigger debuff when I crit failed because I had the spell active, which doesn't make sense. So Veil Confidence actually a pretty good tweak here. I wouldn't call it a buff necessarily, but it now just like it works even when you crit fail and the spell does end still. You still reduce any frightened condition you get from that, which is pretty good. So overall, Veil of Confidence getting a pretty decent change here. In the Darkness domain, we have Darkened Sight, which replaces Darkened Eyes, and now it actually just does a different thing. So before, Darkened Eyes would reduce a target's vision with darkness. And it was like a blind spell, which there are actually already several blind spells like in the game. So it just kind of added to that. And in addition, what it did before is it removed a creature's dark vision. Now, interestingly, it gives a creature essentially greater dark vision, which, well, it does give, I don't know, I said essentially, but yeah, and it allows it to even see through magical darkness. Overall, I think this is a genuinely better effect. There are many ways you can create darkness to make it harder, even for creatures that have dark vision, to just lose their vision, especially since most of the time, this is a spell from a cleric spell list who get access to a variety of spells that can blind easily. So I like Darkened Sight more because something about dark vision or like greater dark vision is it's something that you have to use very frequently. Not many ancestries just have straight up dark vision. And so being able to use a focus point to give someone dark vision, even if it's just for a minute, is pretty good in comparison to giving a spell slot for a similar effect. So I will say this is a general buff, in my opinion, but I could also see in any argument saying that they preferred the old version because darkness, covering someone in darkness makes more sense, which I'll say I agree with, but I think Darkened Sight just is better overall and is more generally helpful. Next up, in the Dream domain, we have Sweet Dream, which has been buffed. It now lasts an hour rather than 10 minutes, and it heightens for additional effects. Now, at 4th rank, the bonus for the Dream, Insight, or Glamour is +2, and at 7th rank, the bonus is +3. So overall, just a straight buff. It does all the same things, and I think it's pretty good. Conversely, also in the dream domain, Dreamer's Call does most of the same things, but now it just doesn't make the enemy off guard. Now it's only Fascinated. Now, this is probably just because Fascinated in itself is a pretty strong debuff, and Off Guard probably just put this spell a little bit above what its intention was. So that's my only guess as to the change. Other than that, the spell operates more or less the same and does most of the same things anyway. I don't think it's a major debuff, but it is technically a debuff. So regardless, well, that's a change. Hurtling Stone got a change. It now no longer uses your strength modifier for the damage, instead doing 2d6 bludgeoning damage, which is pretty consistent with overall many of the damage changes they're doing for spells. But in addition to just, making it better for clerics to use, which I think is overall a good thing, also it pushes the target back. So it's still a spell attack roll, so that didn't change. But when you successfully hit a target, you push them 5 feet. And when you crit succeed, you push them 10 feet. And it's still, as per normal, does full damage or twice the damage on a crit. So overall, a boost to Hurling Stone, in my opinion, making it much better for clerics in general. But also any other class that picks up this domain that just isn't strength focused. I mean, there's really no point. And now it actually pushes the enemy, which is just an additional effect. So I'm going to call this one a straight buff. Soothing Words from the family domain just got a straight buff too, just now lasting a full minute rather than until or 1 round or the start of your next turn. So overall, I can't really say much more other than just a good buff. I always disliked it when you had focus spells that only lasted a round. There's a focus point cost, and that has focus points are not just free, they limited per combat, and in addition, they require time outside of combat, which the party might not have. So effects that were not necessarily straight combat effects were always kind of just not utilized. I feel like stuff like this, where you improve the effects to last for a minute, now it's like you're much more likely to take Soothing Words because it just gives the target a bonus to will saves, which might be very important for our combat. And the bonus actually increases for emotion effects, which again might be very important depending on the type of combat. So Soothing Words, I think, got a very needed buff in this situation. All right, Read Fates, mostly doing the same stuff, but got buffed in its application. Now, it doesn't need a minute to cast, so you can do this in combat, which is kind of big. But in addition to that, it gained a range of 30 feet. So you can, it gained 20 more feet. It had a 10-foot range before. So now this effect is just more useful generally considered in combat, which I think is overall very good. And while this spell is not typically one I would consider like a combat spell, the thing is there just are sometimes situations where a character might have an idea or a course in action that this can be utilized for. And even if that's not the case, one of the benefits about this is you can use Read Fate and refocus without spending essentially an extra minute of time. It's just an overall buff to the general features, no matter how you look at it. So I'm just gonna say it's just a general buff. I really like this change with Read Fate. Fire Ray from the Fire domain got a slight rework, but don't worry, most of the stuff is still the same. It still does the same damage, but rather than doing persistent fire damage when you crit succeed on the target, it now, unless you critically fail, just puts a flame in the space of the target. So what this does is allows you to light a space on fire until the end of the target's next turn, meaning that if the target does not leave, they're going to take an additional d6 fire damage. And as the spell heightens, the damage from this flaming square essentially increases. This gives the spell a much more dynamic way to force an enemy out of a space in combat, or can be much better comboed with an ally to do, like, if you immobilize the enemy, force them to stay in the square. This can actually rack up a sizable amount of damage, much more than the persistent damage probably would have dealt. Especially considering that fire damage is actually one of the easier types of persistent damages to get aid on to make it much more likely to remove the effect. Granted, that would consume actions, of course, but this also requires actions because if the enemy does not move, they're just going to take more damage. And that's overall, in my opinion, a general buff to Fire Ray. Moonbeam from the Moon domain just got a buff. It just does an additional d6 of damage. This isn't even the standard of damage changes where it normally did like spellcasting modifier or whatever. Moonbeam before just did 1d6 of, is it fire damage still? Yeah, fire damage. So that being the case, now it just does 2d6. Just an improvement, so pretty cool. Next up is Waking Nightmare from the Nightmares domain, and it's been reworked just a little bit. So now, rather than making the target flee, when a creature is frightened by this spell, they take 1 additional mental damage each time it's hit by a strike, making this much better for, in general, use with your team. Before, I have the spell over here. It only made the target flee when the target was asleep when you cast the spell, meaning that effect was, in general, most combat, not very useful. Now, while doing most of the same effects based on the effects of the will save, as it heightens, which it didn't before, the mental damage it takes increases by 1, and it's 1 per heightened rank, which is actually pretty good. It's essentially a mental weakness added to strikes, which most creatures don't have a like resistance to mental. The only ones are just creatures that are mindless that just don't take mental damage. So overall, I think this is a general buff because Waking Nightmares before just had an effect that worked when the creature was sleeping, which made this very difficult to use. There are ways you could do it in combat, but most of the time it just wasn't a thing. So this is just much easier to get off, and honestly promotes more team play as it just adds damage to other characters' strikes, which I think is just pretty good. In the Perfection domain, Perfected form got changed to Perfected body. Now no longer is it just a second attempt reroll at the morph, poison, polymorph, or clumsy, doomed, enfeebled, petrified, or sickened conditions, which I think is an addition. Yeah, poison didn't used to be in there, nor was the clumsy, doomed, enfeebled, petrified, or sickened. So this is actually an overall buff. And now what it does is, as a reaction, if you got a crit failure, you actually just got a failure instead. And if you got just a failure, you get a success. So this is overall a really good version of the spell. Before, it was kind of just iffy, and it was only on very few things. Now it has a much wider scale, and it just pretty much improves your level of success. The only thing it not doing is giving you a crit success on a success, which overall I still think makes Perfected Body a really good buff to what was Perfected Form. All right, in the Secrecy domain, we had Forced Quiet. It's now been changed to Whispering Quiet, and it's been reworked a little bit. Now it has a further range of 60 feet rather than 30 feet, and it no longer focuses on a single target, instead hitting an area of a 15-foot burst. This no longer requiring a save, just automatically applying its effect, though it now is defeated if a target is using a sound created with an effect that has the sonic trait. So overall, Whispering Quiet, I will call this a general buff. I mean, affecting more targets, not even really requiring a save, as it does mostly the same thing. Granted, before, obviously, the target could just, or couldn't move out depending on the save. Now they can just move out of a 15-foot burst. So, I think there's ups and downs to either form of this quiet spell, whatever you want to call it. I do think this form is better, just having a bigger range and being able to affect multiple targets, and they don't even get a save for the effect, meaning this is a really good zoning tool, if nothing else. So I think Whispering Quiet overall is a really good buff to what was Forced Quiet. Also in the Secrecy domain, Safeguard Secret got a buff, no longer requiring a full minute to cast, which is pretty good. 2 actions, very solid, and it got a range buff as well, going to 20 or additional 30 feet. It was 10 feet, now it is 30 feet. Otherwise, it does mostly the same stuff, but again, this is something that you can do immediately in a situation that, might call for it. So I generally like the idea of most of these cleric domain spells being made so they can be done even in combat if a situation were to arrive, or if anything, just not wasting a full minute of time to do a focus spell that would then require to sit down for 10 minutes to get it back. So I think this is generally a buff just for overall utility purposes. In the Sun domain, we got a name change here that makes a lot of sense because positive luminance now is vital luminance, since we've changed from positive damages or healing to vital. Makes a ton of sense. And it's been changed slightly. Before, it started off as a 10-foot emanation, but increased by 10 foot every round. Now it's a 30-foot emanation flat. It doesn't change as you increase the number of rounds. In all honesty, this just makes it a better applicable buff for, immediate use. But overall, this doesn't really change, I think, much of how the spell would be utilized. And if you're generally unfamiliar with how positive luminance worked before anyway, is you got this building reservoir of energy that you built up, and then you could explode it on a target by ending the spell, and any creatures that attack you within the area would take damage, mostly undead creatures, of course. Now, this just has a much bigger area, meaning that you don't have to necessarily worry about necessarily range attacks or super big undead or anything like that. And of course, by the time that the third round would come around anyway, and it's about the same, is probably by the time you're going to use, as most combats last 3 to 5 rounds, give or take. Now, you can be upset, and understandably so, that it can't get bigger than that if you're doing a particular combat thing, or trying to do like a setup where you do this thing and then jump in on a bunch of enemies right when you're, fit to burst. But I think overall, this is just a much better improvement, as it just makes the area genuinely bigger, and it makes it you a better light source as well in dark situations. And because it has the light, the light tag on it, it can be used and helpful against darkness type effects. So overall, I think Vital Luminance getting a pretty decent buff here. All right, in the travel domain, Traveler's Transit just got a slight buff. It now lasts 5 minutes rather than 1 minute, which I think is pretty cool. So yeah, that's it. That's the only change, is it just lasts longer now. But I think that's just better overall. In the Tyranny domain, a Touch of Obedience also got a buff. Now doing Stupified 2 rather than Stupified 1, which it was doing before. Granted, that is on a failure and crit failure, not the normal success, but this just makes the enemy more stupefied, which is only a good thing. That's it. That's the big thing. That's the only thing that really changed, is it just increase the amount of stupefy the enemy gets if they fail. It's a pretty good buff. Stupefied's a really good condition, honestly. And with Commanding Lash, the next spell in the Tyranny domain, also getting a buff. Now, if the target is frightened or stupefied or taking any kind of persistent damage, it takes a -2 circumstance penalty to the save of the command that the Commanding Lash would do. Regardless of the result, the target becomes immune for an hour, which does make Commanding Lash a little bit weaker before, because you could just continue using Commanding Lash as long as you had focus points. But now Commanding Lash works a lot better with Touch of Obedience, making it so that the enemy is far less likely to succeed and even more likely to crit fail the check against the command spell. And because it's stupefied gives a status penalty to a target's will save. This will give a -2 to circumstance penalty, making it overall a -4 to the command, which is pretty nuts. So overall, the Tyranny domain getting a massive boost. In Wealth domain, we have precious metals now including shields, which is very good considering that before, unless the shield was a bulk 1 item, it was somewhat difficult to utilize. So the biggest benefit for precious metals on shields is if you use shield block against a creature that has a material weakness, for instance, Fey and Silver, then it will trigger their weakness. That also works for armor, which it did before, but maybe your character is not necessarily wearing metal armor and is still wielding a shield. That being the case, this is actually a pretty good change to precious metals. And the final domain change here, we have Weapon Surge from the Zeal domain. Now has been reworked, no longer giving an additional die of damage, which I'm sure some people will be upset with, but it now does an additional d6 of spirit damage. Now, this is actually a pretty sizable buff because Weapon Surge before actually started falling off later game. One, it never heightened, which now it does, doing additional spirit damage as you use the effect. But before, with Weapon Surge, it only gave you a 1 extra die up to a maximum of 3, which means at the third, where when you had a major striking rune, Weapon Surge did almost nothing for you other than giving you just a singular bonus of die. Now this scales with the game, now giving additional dice, maybe not as big as your weapon, sure, but additional dice, and it's spirit damage. And this can be sanctified, meaning it can do even more damage to unholy or holy creatures, depending on the kind of character you're playing. This is overall a huge buff to Weapon Surge, and honestly a much needed one, as Weapon Surge was a really good effect that just fell off as the game continued, not even really scaling with the game, and eventually just becoming almost useless, as there are much better ways to get status bonuses even as the game continues. So overall, I will say that Weapon Surge is much, much better. And that's gonna be it for the video. Hope y'all enjoyed, and if you did, like the video and subscribe if you want to see more. I'm going to be continuing talking about Pathfinder 2e. I also have another remaster video coming up this next week. I'm going to be doing the ancestry changes. I'm doing some more remaster videos just because the Archive of Nethys and Path Builder are taking a little bit extra time to get set up. So not everyone is going to have access to the new rules, and I figured I'll do my part and get more information out to y'all as well. So yeah, just trying to do my part for the community until everything officially comes out in a free form. But that's going to be it for me. Thank y'all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the remaster stuff to me, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye.